On the northernmost tip of New Jersey is a bizarre peninsula island peppered with abandoned military structures, unnatural earthworks, and depressions from another time. This is Sandy Hook's Fort Hancock, and believe it or not, there was a time when this peninsula island transformed American security. You see, across American history, it's somewhat accepted that the building of fortifications for defense of crucial terrain and waterways wasn't always done in time, or sometimes was never appropriately done at all. As you might suspect, this structural neglect applied very heavily to the American South, where publications often criticize a lack of unity in defense terrain or a lack of structures protecting significant cities. Still, it was also a problem for a long time in the North, and that was the case until nationalism spread across the young United States after the War of 1812, leading to the creation of many forts, such as Fort Hancock and Sandy Hook. But what is the story of this old forgotten fortress? Stay tuned to find out, as today we discover the history of Fort Hancock and Sandy Hook. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. Let's get some context. New York Harbor traditionally was only accessible via a southern approach through the lower New York Bay. By contrast, the northern route through the Long Island Sound had many shoals, rocks, and shipwrecks. So for many decades of the city's history, mariners would prefer to access the highly profitable harbor through the lower bay, taking them past Long Beach, Staten Island, and small Sandy Hook Peninsula, and things remained this way for ages. That is until undersea blasting, charting, and navigation was made easier through the 20th century. Due to the valuable position of the peninsula, the first large lighthouse was built in 1764 to guide ships unfamiliar with the crowded waters. From then on out, the sandy scrap of land would have an ever-increasing value in strategic planning. The peninsula, like the city itself, was easily overcome and occupied by the British in the Revolutionary War. Throughout the war, the peninsula would remain under British control, and the lighthouse proved too well reinforced to destroy with the underpowered artillery of the Continental Army. So between 1806 and 1817, most of the peninsula was sold to the federal government. Then, a small fort named Gates was built during the War of 1812, but it wasn't until the 1850s that recommendations to build a large, hardened fortress on the island were put into action. This heavily reinforced fort was started in 1817, with the completion of a wharf for receiving heavy supplies, and then the progress escalated in 1859 with the laying of foundations and thick stone walls, cannons for long-range defense, and berthing for the 10th New York Volunteer Infantrymen were completed. Still, at this point, the fort itself was never really brought into its full glory, as the American Civil War drew resources to more valuable fortifications near the borders of the seceding states. It would only be after the American Civil War that true defensive installations were finally placed on the island. For one, the advancement of rifled heavy guns started in Europe and escalated significantly by the Civil War, making those 3-mile ranging, highly inaccurate smoothbore cannons in the federal defense system inadequate and outdated. Triggered by new naval construction across America and the European powers, President Cleveland ordered a joint naval, army, and civilian board to investigate and draft designs for improved naval fortifications and firepower, and the mission was chaired by Secretary of War William C. Endicott. With that in mind, the construction, rifle manufacturing, and design improvements across America would be named the Endicott Era. And so it was. The Sandy Hook facilities were merged, improved, and named Fort Hancock. In 1895, the fort was officially designated Fort Hancock, with construction of new strengthened buildings, walls, and gun emplacements mainly being after 1898. Battery Potter was built in 1895, with 2 breech-loading, rifled, 12-inch calibrated guns elevated from concealed positions by specialized steam engines. This was the only time American engineers would use such a lift system. These guns more than doubled the previous firing range and had far better accuracy. But there was a downside. They would need to be retracted to the main floor for reloading, wasting time in the case of a potential invasion in the harbor. To compensate, the new counterbalanced rifle trolleys were designed, vastly improving the firing rate and reducing cost. These counterweighted guns would be rapidly positioned over the walls by letting the ballasted arms swing the weapon over the top before the recoil would send the counterweight back to its upright position to reload and conceal the gun, marking the beginning of America's beloved disappearing guns. 7 12-inch guns were installed at Hancock, and 16 6, 8, and 10-inch guns from 1896 to 1909. To complement the disappearing guns of the fort, 2 specialized concrete, steel, and earthen dams sheltered the fort's 16 breech-loading mortars in sets of 8s. Each mortar could fire new half-ton armor-piercing shells in steep arches towards approaching enemy ships, hopefully plunging through the less armored main decks. As for the smaller warships, like the rapidly emerging torpedo boat, which eventually evolved into the 20th century destroyers and patrol torpedo ships, Fort Hancock installed 5 batteries of 3, 4, and 5-inch guns from 1898 to 1904. These were all supplied by deep concrete bunkers built into the peninsula for ammunitions and powder that were buried over with layers of dirt, making the valuable ammunition impervious to any attacks of the day. Then, by World War II, there were 2 new threats that Hancock needed to defend against. Dreadnoughts, battleships, and battlecruisers could all far outrange coastal defenses by the 40s, all while having far larger guns that by now could have enough armor-piercing firepower to breach the lower shield walls if they knew where to hit. And they could find out exactly where to fire, now thanks to seaplanes and carrier-launched aircraft. These planes could direct the main guns of the battleships onto the concealed guns or simply destroy them on their own. As one counter, improved 120-inch barbette guns were installed in Battery, Kingston, and Mills, matching the new warship's range in 1917. The 1940s added anti-aircraft gun of multiple calibers. However, the coastal gun concept would not survive World War II in the United States, not after aviation played such a massive role in victory during the war. Things would only escalate further when weapons with a far greater range than a cannon were introduced to the world during the Cold War. Along with them were major security concerns, a factor that continues to be an issue to the modern day. And perhaps much like Sandy Hook exemplified secrecy and security in its prime, we also face a similar imperative to protect our data in the digital age. And with the help of our sponsor, Delete Me, I'd like to take a quick time out to discuss that. We've all made the mistake of offering up our personal information to the wrong online shop, and the next thing you know, the spam just starts flooding in. I've also done it, and basically what happened here is that your information was sold to data brokers. But with the correct awareness and some simple steps, you now have the power to remove your personal data that is exposed online. Delete Me is a fantastic service that will erase your personal data from PeopleSearch websites. I'm talking about hundreds of data brokers selling your information. And it's an ongoing process. Once they clean house, they'll keep scanning for new data that shows up so they can remove that also. Thanks to Delete Me, I could remove old listings containing my vital records like former addresses, professional background, and even family photos. So that's all to say that with Delete Me's ongoing monitoring, I feel confident that I can continue enjoying the privacy everyone deserves. I'd encourage you to do the same. According to the Guardian article I recently read, just one click on the wrong junk mail can lead to a full-on deluge, resulting in piles of unwanted mail, some of which might even look legitimate. So if you want to get your personal information removed from search results on the web, go to joindeleteme.com/socash. Delete Me is offering 20% off their privacy plans to all my viewers with code SOCASH. Again, that's joindeleteme.com/socash, promo code SOCASH. By 1947, the US was left to prepare for a new and more conservative defense plan. The large coastal guns at Fort Hancock were mainly removed and sold for scrap. By 1948, just a few men and officers inhabited the base to shut it down for good. And that happened on January the 3rd, 1950. All static defenses held by the Army around New York Harbor were officially and formally dismissed. A small section of New York Army Corps engineers took over the fort for final processing. In contrast, small sects of the reservation were kept isolated from the Army, providing grounds for confidential testing and exercises. But before it could be shut down for good, the world was shaken by another senseless and brutal war. On June the 25th, 1950, 48 hours before Fort Hancock was inactivated, a tragic event occurred, dooming Secretary of Defense Johnson Austerity's program altogether. Basically, powerful tank-equipped North Korean columns crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. A lightning-like advance down the Uijeongbu corridor routed defending forces and led to the early capture of Seoul and the flight of the South Korean government. Meanwhile, on the 27th, the United Nations recommended that its members support the Republic of Korea, which by that time it had recognized as the lawful government of the troubled peninsula. President Harry S. Truman committed the United States ground forces stationed in Japan to fight a delaying action and slow the North Korean steamroller. Reinforcements rushed from the United States, and units sent by many other nations reached South Korea in time to stall the communist column around the perimeter. This was the start of the brutal Korean War. As the Korean War dragged on, America's burgeoning defense philosophy was proven wrong, even if the reasoning had been sound. In April, after coalition armed forces recrossed the 38th parallel, an Army congressional meeting agreed that Fort Hancock would be reactivated and modernized once again. The Army would reclaim 2/3 of Sandy Hook for the Nike Ajax and Hercules air-to-air missiles, which we've discussed in detail before on our other videos. Well, perhaps somewhat oddly, the rest of the public land would be reserved for recreation. As the fighting in Korea ended and the world wondered where the next war might be, Secretary of the Army Robert Stevens made sure in a press conference it would not be in America, as the new Nike anti-air missiles and Sky Sweeper radar-guided anti-air cannons would be deployed in critical locations across the country. However, construction for the Fort Hancock system would be more difficult than previous locations chosen further inland. The Hook's position is a notoriously hazardous and windy part of New York Harbor, prone to fierce winter storms and powerful hurricanes, and this meant that the traditional radar installations wouldn't be adequate. Instead, the Army Corps of Engineers installed a massive nylon-covered radome over the primary tracking radar. Radomes were designed to protect sensitive radar sets in the snow-prone observation stations in northern Canada, but quickly proved their general utility and practicality. Radomes were made of panels of treated nylon fabric zipped together and then secured from the outside with steel clips that would create an airtight bubble inside the dome. It was anchored around the radar installation and inflated by large air pumps that kept constant pressure inside the dome. In 1966, the remaining 4 radars, along with supporting equipment, were also protected with inflated radomes. Before then, the battery had been a rotating staff of Nike missiles and crews continuously transferred from one base to another. In 1953, while much of the work was still underway, Fort Hancock and its garrison were used to film the documentary Steel Ring, where reporters were toured through the site as senior officers explained the function of Nike missiles and the defense of America's largest city that they provided. The film showed the men going about their daily lives as well as drills for detecting an incoming attack. It aired in April, showing many Americans what was being done to defend their homes. Still, if you knew anything about the Cold War, it's that time waited for no man, while the missile race grew tenser and tenser. Gradually, despite growing NATO and Soviet technology advancements, there were concerns that the Nike Ajax was losing its effectiveness. The growing fear of newer, long-range nuclear missiles attacking the USA pushed the country towards a less conventional strategy: interception. And this is precisely when Western Electric and Douglas Aircraft developed the Nike Hercules to improve the Ajax range and payload enough to house small atomic warheads. These warheads, designated to minimize risks of sabotage, would detonate in the middle of aircraft and missile formations to destroy multiple targets at once before they could even enter American airspace. Hercules would be installed all across America, including the Fort Hancock battery in 1959. In other words, Sandy Hook saw America through what might have been the most high-stakes moment of the Cold War. Then, in 1960, the New York-Philadelphia corridor was reinforced with a new control center named Missile Master in the Highlands. This was the latest and greatest in missile networking and fire control in the event of an attack. Missile Master would ensure that no target received too much attention while in peace. It guaranteed that friendly aircraft wouldn't be shot down by any of its responsible batteries. Through the course of the Cold War, tensions did eventually de-escalate. Agreements spearheaded by Nixon and Brezhnev from 1969 onwards aimed to reduce the risk of continuous tension and escalation. Eventually, the goal of these negotiations, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, would have dramatic long-term effects on America and the USSR. From the negotiations came the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, further reducing both sides' use of nuclear weapons. The signing of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972 with the USSR went as far as ending the Large Ballistic Interceptor missiles in both countries, limiting each party to just ABM sites. One was officially allowed to guard each of their capital cities, and another allowed for a select number of ICBM sites. In 1974, both countries agreed that only one site would be allowed. Surprisingly, the USSR chose to keep their defense missiles around Moscow, while America chose to maintain theirs around Grand Forks and the ICBM site in North Dakota. Through technicalities and a lack of effective alternatives, the forward-deployed Nike Hercules in Europe wouldn't be replaced until Patriots introduced in the 1980s. Hercules missiles sold to Taiwan would remain activated until the 1990s, whereas South Korea still had some of theirs activated well past the turn of the century. These negotiations and arm limitations eased any capability for the Army to continue manning its massive list of Hercules sites, and therefore the Army began closing sites and deactivating their missiles throughout 1974, with Fort Hancock being formally deactivated on August the 15th of that same year. The final arrangements were completed on New Year's Eve, and on January the 1st, 1975, Fort Hancock would be closed for the final time. Historian Thomas Hoffman writes, quote, Sandy Hook had witnessed the entire progression of fortifications and weapons used to defend American harbors. This legacy has made Sandy Hook a prime example of American coastal defense history from colonial times throughout the missile era. That's hard to argue, and part of why Sandy Hook is now a protected national park. Fully open to the public, the park now offers trails, historical lessons about the history of the peninsula, archery, cycling, kayaking, and camping. You can even rent out a Sandy Hook chapel for your weddings or special events. So, while most of the area's military legacy is gone, Sandy Hook now reflects on a newer, brighter America. What was once a fort designed to hold back invaders, aircraft, and finally missiles is now a public space for people to enjoy free of fear and doubt. That's right, now you can just come here, enjoy the beach and the view of New York Harbor, or watch the waves and passing ships. So perhaps in a world still clouded by fear and conflict, Sandy Hook has transformed to provide a space where America can just get away from it all. And I guess we'll leave it there for today, but I thank you for watching and subscribing. Until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.